Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
All right, we're live.
We are live. Mark Brahman and myself, Rick Rockwell, and we are continuing our discussion on all things Apolloism, and more specifically, the gods. On the last broadcast, we spoke for over an hour about the god Mars, and from a very comprehensive, it was a very comprehensive discussion, I would say, where we look at it from a lot of different angles. Representation, some of the characteristics and how they've evolved over time. And so this time we are going to be looking at Jupiter, otherwise often known as Zeus, but not exactly, and we'll get into that. And some of the origins, some of the purpose, some of the representation, and how some of the mythologies around Jupiter apply to Apolloism and all of us. So are you ready for that, Mark?
Yes, I am ready. Absolutely.
Okay, so the origin, I mean, we have Deus Pater. Most people will know. Most people familiar at all with Greco-Roman mythology and the gods will know that the origin goes back further into the Aryan or Indo-European history. And it comes from the term sky father, Deus Pater, essentially meaning that Jupiter or Zeus, there are variations of that, and it represents a overarching father. And this very early on, of course, this would have been the term father, of course, would have been the head of a family, the head of a clan. This would evolve into the leader of a tribe, and then the leader of a kingdom and a state, a republic, and finally an empire, right? And that's kind of what we see. And, one of the things that is sort of commonly put together is that Jupiter is Zeus, Zeus is Jupiter. They're sort of one and the same. But that's not entirely correct. There's actually some significant differences between the two in terms of, I guess, would you say how they were represented, Mark?
Well, Zeus in Greece is, that's where the myth is established, right? So, it points to a kind of general, a sort of different character between the Greeks and the Romans generally. So the myth, generally, the Greco-Roman myth is established in Greece, and Rome is taking that myth and reforming it in some ways in a direction that they believe to be, to serve their ends or to serve the interests of their society. So the nature of Roman religion is different, ultimately. We might even say kind of fundamentally different than Greek religion, though that may be too dramatic. So there's a different character to the Roman religion, and the Greek religion is more, there's more kind of, I would say even the kind of mythic and narrative elements of Greek myth are more inflected in Greek religion, where, again, this is where the myths form. And some of the myths are, frankly, don't kind of show the gods in the most flattering light,
Mm.
for example. And so there is a kind of that aspect to Greek society, which we could argue is even kind of more liberal ultimately. Now, this also represents a kind of stage of Greek civilization where it is becoming more liberal and you know, that's not the same sort of liberalism that we live in today, but there are kind of some similarities. And we see this, of course, with Greek philosophy. We can say that Greek philosophy, for example, is a kind of product of a greater sort of intellectual liberalism or curiosity or freedom or creativity in Greece versus Rome, and a kind of open-mindedness, for better or worse. But yeah, there is a different character. They're essentially the same god, though. Zeus and Jupiter are essentially the same god, and we might even say that their characters are not as different as kind of the milieu in which they exist, whether in the Greek or Roman milieu.
Yeah, I would say one of the things I find
There's a
interesting.
kind of consistency. I would say there's a kind of consistency to their character, even if there's some dissimilarity in their representation or significance in each of those cultures. Anyways.
Yeah, the broad strokes I'd say are definitely the same. I mean, they're clearly powerful. They're clearly the authority figure. They're clearly responsible for the well-being of their people. You know, some of the differences I think are instructive in some ways. Zeus, for example, has multiple wives, whereas Jupiter only had one wife, and Juno. Zeus fathered quite a few children, many more children than Jupiter did. So, I mean, in some senses, you could, and even actually in just sort of the descriptions, Zeus, you get very detailed sort of physical descriptions of him, whereas Jupiter is always, I don't want to say obtuse, but just a little more vague and a little more distant in the description. So I think probably really what this is, well, maybe two things. You know, the Greeks, for example, were very close to other, you know, early civilizations, which could have had some influence in how these things were portrayed. Probably more so, though, I think that this is, you know, a conscious effort on the part of the Romans to sort of clean up the image a little bit and just sort of reinvigorate the values that they thought should be embodied by Jupiter. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. So with Roman religion, we see a kind of rehabilitation of Greco. We see an adoption of Greek religion to a large extent, but we also see a kind of rehabilitation of Greek religion, and especially of certain characters and their status within that religion. We spoke of Mars last time, right? So Mars becomes a kind of elevated and venerated figure in Rome, whereas he is a kind of foil, and he's a kind of is sometimes depicted as a kind of adversary, you might say, in Greece, right? So we see that difference. So there are notable differences. You say when you talk about, you know, Zeus being the father of many children, it's not necessarily that that's not the case in Greek religion, or rather of having many different wives or mistresses or you know, dalliances of with other women. That, of course, emerges in Greek myth and is a kind of parabolic element or narrative element of the religion. Now, it's not that that's not the case in Roman religion, but it is. The myth elements of the religion are kind of downplayed, you could say. There's less of a kind of parabolic or mythic element. And maybe part of that is because all the stories are already established, right? They've become a canon, as it were. Right. And so there's less of a kind of emphasis on that. And there's more of an emphasis, I would say, in the context of Roman religion, in a kind of healthy way, there's more of an emphasis on the archetype itself, or the character, the personalities of the gods themselves, as opposed to mythic histories or stories around them. But just to further the point, it is of course meaningful from our perspective that, like, I think that one tendency, well, there are a couple of things I'll say here. One is that I think that one thing, and I think that this is kind of a bad thing, so I'm not endorsing it, but I think that one of the things that people find attractive about paganism versus Christianity, for example, is that they have this idea, well, with paganism, we can be more sexually free, right? And there's a kind of, because we see nudity both in the Greek and Roman art, and there are these kind of decadent aspects of Greek, especially Greek culture, also Roman culture, that are occurring at a certain time during the development of these civilizations that ultimately represent a kind of decadence or represent subversive movements, sometimes often emerging from chthonic cults, often finding their ultimate origin or one of their earliest origins, at least, to the extent that origin can be found in Greece, in Crete, or in Thebes. So there are these kind of decadent but also subversive movements in both civilizations, that I think, when people are like, oh, I want to be pagan, in some cases that's sort of their motive, is because they're attracted to sort of subversive and decadent elements of the Greco-Roman civilization.
Many such cases.
Yes, and that's not the case here, and it's actually one of the reasons that we call it Apolloism, right? Now, Apollo himself, there are these kind of decadent myths associated with Apollo as well. And again, I would say that this is a consequence of these subversive movements, often having an origin in Crete or Thebes. Sparta as well has a kind of subversive aspect to it that may ultimately have a Cretan origin as well, right? So a pre-Hellenic origin is probably the best way of describing it. And as opposed to of being a part of a kind of later Olympian tradition, as it's often described.
Right.
But to this idea that he is the father of, and I think that as part of this point, I think people find Jupiter as and maybe we discussed this on other podcasts, so I'll be quick, and I don't want to be too redundant. But Jupiter, one of the things that people might find it attractive about Jupiter is that he is kind of a cad, right? He's this sort of guy who's betting all these women, and he's kind of a player, right? You might say, and he has access to all these women, and I think that some people also find that attractive about the deity. Now, I think
it's just over the years, those things have been kind of distorted. I mean, power and authority, those sort of things would have come, more or less naturally. And I think there's just been such a Christianity, or such a, I don't know, kind of I don't want to say piousness, but sort of a sanctimoniousness that's come with Christianity, that these things are kind of reflexively looked upon now as character flaws, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things going on here, right? So I think that, like, part of that is pointing to a sort of early barbaric character, I would say, of an Aryan origin in Greece or wherever. That the barbarian is going to be he's going to be kind of less discerning, more promiscuous in the wives he takes, and this sort of thing, right? And I think this is actually something that they identify with different characters in the Hebrew Bible, for example. There is a kind of a sort of overabundant spendthrift Aryan character that's just like, in its kind of earliest manifestation, when it's conquering and establishing civilization, there is a kind of lustfulness to the Aryan type, we could say, right?
It's an expression of power, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just a kind of, this is nature on some level, right? So it's not something to be condemned or whatever the case might be. But I think that one thing that we can point to in the myth itself, now that sort of type may become less sustainable as civilization becomes more developed, right? And monogamy becomes more of a thing, for example. And monogamy is really a kind of characteristic of European civilization or European culture versus the polygamy you find in the Middle East or whatever the case may be.
Right.
So I mean, one way of looking at it is there might be a kind of early polygamy in Aryan society before it becomes more civilized, right? And that seems like a kind of likely thing, where chieftains would have more access to women and this sort of thing. But as things become, as civilization seeks stability and structure and productivity, the society develops in kind of more manageable or sustainable ways, right?
Yeah.
And so monogamy, both in Greece and Rome, was understood as that was the kind of standard, right? They were monogamous as opposed to, and so the gods, to the extent that they were polygamous, are distinct from the mortals in that regard, right? In the way that we could say that, like we can imagine like the average man now maybe divorce is more common now, but the average man gets married and ideally, maybe he has a second wife, but ideally he stays with a woman that he marries and they have a monogamous relationship and they raise children. And this is especially useful for, or thought to be healthier for, the development of children and this sort of thing. There's stability there, so it's a generally a good model. But then we look at the sort of wealthy people in the society, and they have, the men have access to, unlimited access essentially to women in some cases, and so the lifestyle is kind of naturally different just based on the sort of milieu or the conditions of that existence in these sort of higher rungs of society. So you might even make that kind of comparison with the gods in the ancient world, is that there's a different lifestyle because they are these sort of all powerful beings.
Yeah.
Now,
it's a byproduct of power and expression of power.
Yeah. Now, what I'll say, but the ancients understood themselves as distinct from the gods in this way, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I'll say about on this point as well is that there is also, you can argue, a kind of subversive element to some of this too. And maybe subversive is not even the right word. I mean, the other word that could be is a kind of true aspect, at least demonstrated in the myth. So, for example, Jupiter will father many children by different women, but some of those children will end up being essentially what we would describe as proto-Jewish figures. I mean, Bacchus would be a very important example. Mercury would be another example. In Vulcan, as we've discussed on other calls, is he may not even be Jupiter's, or he actually is not Jupiter's son. He's Hera or Juno's son, but his father could be some chthonic being, whether Saturn or Tartarus or whatever the case may be, right? That's sort of implied in the myth. So, and obviously those are not things that we look at and say, oh, well, it's great that Juno had a child with some, proto-Jewish god or whatever, like those. So whether they're subversive or it's a kind of true description, I think you understand my point. There's a kind of complexity there. There's this sort of,
and I think one good thing to take away from that as well is, with the whether it's the Roman pantheon or the Greek Olympians, just the portrayal and the understanding, it just implies a kind of dynamism to Apolloism, in the sense that you do have some you do have some sort of say in the representation, right? Like whether you want the gods to be portrayed in a more salubrious, wholesome manner or not. It's not written in stone, as they say.
Yeah, but it's in the idea too is also this idea of a living God or a creative God, so that we're, as you say, that we're responsible for the representation of our gods. So we're not being given a we're deciding how they're represented, whether in static forms of art like a visual representation, or in maybe more importantly in some ways in a narrative way, because mythos is a kind of, as Aristotle defines mythos, it equals action, right? So what action are the gods given? And we can point to actions that are clearly salubrious and moralizing, such as Jupiter overthrowing Typhon, Apollo overthrowing Python, and those sort of things. But you basically have two components. You have the god, who's the symbol, and he's basically a kind of immutable symbol. He always has the same significance, and usually it's a kind of ethnic significance. So you have the god as a symbol, and then you have mythos, which is a separate element. Mythos and parable, which represents action, and that's sort of the action that you give to the god. And through that action is either venerating the god and in the god's interests and continuing the god, which in the case of the Aryan celestial gods, we want to do that, or it's kind of contrary to his interests and it's defaming or showing defeat or harming the god, right?
Yeah.
So it is kind of, I guess in that way, Apolloism is a kind of, it's for intelligent people, I think is one way of looking at it, which I think is a good thing. Because ultimately Apolloism is about establishing a global elite, as ambitious as a goal sounds, because certainly that's needed.
It's a dynamic religion, and I mean, things are different, obviously. Some people, for whatever reason, they just get really sort of hung up on, dogma and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, people like just structures. They like things that they can just, they want to kind of flip a switch and turn off their mind and be told a kind of activity that they're assured is good or positive, and that is useful for the civilization, for example.
Yeah.
It's now, but I think that, ultimately, and you've pointed this out before, Rick, as well, is that it will be useful for us to develop ritual, and this will be ritual that we design that has a kind of salubrious significance and meaning. So it has a positive meaning and significance. So it will be useful to do that, and also to develop myths, right? So all those things are things that we can do, and those can become, based on their quality, their adherence to a kind of REM understanding, they will either abide or disappear. But they can be looked at from that lens and say, okay, well, that's a salubrious myth. We should continue it. It becomes a tradition, becomes a myth that I can teach my children, this sort of thing. And the same with the rituals. Anyways, please.
And I think with myth, I think actually the birth of Jupiter or Zeus, I mean, those myths are very similar, and their rise to power, I think that's very, very instructive as a myth, as relates to Cronus or Saturn. Can you talk about that and just your interpretation of that?
Yeah, definitely. So basically, between Jupiter has a big primary rival. Well, he has two, but one we discussed on the last call, Typhon, right? And Typhon is the son of Saturn, bearing a similar ethnic significance to Saturn, or identical ethnic significance, we can say. Saturn is a proto-Jewish god. This is identified by Tacitus. Now, Tacitus, not all of Tacitus's information is reliable, and that's something that people will point out when they're criticizing this identification. But when you look at when you accept that understanding, and you look at the rest of the myth body of the Greco-Roman, myths, that conclusion seems like a kind of like obvious conclusion, or it makes sense when you listen to what other mythographers are saying, and when you're analyzing the myths in a critical way. That identification appears to be 100% accurate. So Saturn is a proto-Jewish figure, and he's the main opponent of Jupiter. Now, Saturn, in a way, because we talk about this term monotheism is kind of not a great term. I don't think it's a great term, but it does have some significance or meaning. But basically, especially monotheism refers to the veneration of a deity who's a kind of jealous god, like Yahweh, in the sense that he won't abide any other idols or gods before him. He has to be the sole sort of focus. Now, again, Yahweh has angels. There's Satan, and there are other gods or deities in this cosmology. So, officially, it's hard to say it's a kind of monotheism. But on the other hand, the emphasis put on the chieftain god, who is a jealous god, and who is the only one who, at least in Judaism, that can be worshipped. Right? You're not allowed to worship angels. Angels you acknowledge as these forces in the world, but the focus of the veneration and worship is to Yahweh himself. Similar thing occurs in Christianity, where Jesus, I make the argument that Jesus essentially is a kind of stand-in for Yahweh. He's a Jewish figure ultimately, and he's identified by the same terms, both in the Greek Hebrew Bible and in the Greek New Testament. He's referred to as the Lord by the same Greek word, right? So, in other words, there's Yahweh and Jesus are on some level synonyms, you could argue. And so a similar thing happens in Christianity. There's a kind of hyper focus on Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the truth, the path, the life, the way, to the exclusion of all these other angels or other beings. So the term monotheism has some meaning. But again, it's a kind of it has to kind of like be looked at in a kind of critical way. But we see a kind of monotheism with Kronos. Kronos ultimately represents this kind of tyrannical like a god that represents monotheism on some level, in the sense that he wants to kind of destroy all his children and all the gods that descend from him, or ostensibly descend from him. And we can get to that in a second. He swallows all the Olympians. So he's a consuming god, much like Yahweh. He's a consuming god. Yahweh is a god that's, who's represented by a fire, and he's always consuming these offerings, these animal offerings, these grain offerings, these goat offerings, that I make the argument, much like the symbolism that appears in Christianity, where the flock represents humans, these resources also represent humans. So he's a consuming god, and he's called the consuming fire. Yahweh's called the consuming fire. Kronos is much the same, or Saturn is much the same. He actually devours his children, right? So he has that similarity. He devours his children, and the only one that escapes is Jupiter. And this is interesting, of course, as well. Jupiter, or in the Greek mythology, originally called Zeus, he is spirited away by the wife, Rhea, and I think to Mount Ida. Mount Ida is a kind of important symbol in the Greco-Roman world as well, and ultimately has a kind of pre-Hellenic significance. Is ultimately pointing to sort of pre-Hellenic cults, and he's protected there by Rhea, and then he becomes a wine, or rather a cupbearer in the court of Saturn.
Now, a cupbearer, is that not? Is there not a sexual reference to that, like a homosexual reference? We're cupbearers.
Yeah, well, there is
Yeah.
actually. And so in Crete, there was a kind of system in Crete, in particular. There was a system of Pataresti. Now, Pataresti is a little bit of an inexact term, but because sometimes the homosexuality is occurring at the age of 17, which, in the ancient world is that pederastic, but it could have occurred as early as 13, which we would all agree is pederastic. But yeah, so Crete has this system, and the reason, the cup itself could have a kind of vaginal, dare I say, kind of anal significance. That's part of the symbolism that's going on, but a cup actually was given to these catamites, right? A catamite is a term. It ultimately is, I think it is Etruscan in origin, but appears in the Latin, I want to say, catamite becomes a term describing the boy who's part of this relationship. And the boy is the passive member, he has a kind of female identity versus the older man, right?
Right.
So you could make that argument, and I think that that's kind of a fair way to look at that presentation, at least in that myth. Now,
Well, and it also does work with Saturn sort of consuming Aryans, or consuming even just the local population. Like if we were to interpret this, like if we were to look at this as an allegory for, say, Aryans moving into a new area, modern Greece, and there's currently people living there, maybe proto-Jews, maybe some mixture, and it's a simple allegory for them sort of overthrowing it. Do you think that would be accurate, or do you think there's more to it?
well, the way that I read that myth in particular is I do think what it suggests is a kind of, which I think is what you're kind of getting at. It does suggest a kind of urbanization, maybe, where there is a kind of more subtle dealing, essentially, with a ethnic or racial competitor, right? So, in other words, it's not like if Jupiter is the cupbearer who outwits and tricks Saturn to ultimately regurgitate his brothers and sisters, who are the Olympians. He does it through a kind of trickery, right? And the fact that he's a cupbearer suggests a kind of civilizational decadence or urbanization. But nevertheless, it does, and in some ways, I think the story from our perspective is a kind of moralizing one, because it shows that we also kind of have this guile within us as well, or to use that we can practice a kind of power seeking within a civilizational context. The civilization doesn't have to collapse and become entirely barbaric for us to be, to win against adversaries, but rather they can be sort of outsmarted on some level, and we can reestablish dominance in the civilization. I mean, if we use the example of America as having this WASP elite that was overthrown ultimately, we'll say by Saturn, that WASP elite we can understand is representing an earlier god, like a Uranus or Caelus, right? We can make that metaphor. And now, please.
Sorry. It's interesting because when I was thinking about that this morning, I was thinking about Cortez and the Aztecs, or Pizarro, and was it the Inca, right?
Yeah.
In South America. And I mean, it's almost, it's almost a repetition of what could have happened earlier on, right?
Sure. In what sense, though? You're saying because they used guile basically to infiltrate that society, and
I mean, you have Montezuma, sacrificing and killing his own children, consuming them, as it were, and then you have an Aryan figure in Cortez, who's able to outmaneuver, and eventually overtake the civilization, right? The same thing with Pizarro. I mean, Pizarro, it's almost an identical story as well. I can't remember the name of the Inca king, but they essentially captured him with just a few hundred men, right in the heart of an empire of thousands, and through guile they were able to kind of overthrow this older pre-existing culture, right?
Yeah. No, I understand your point, and I think that it's true. I mean, I think that is one thing that we have to understand, or we have to kind of admit, is that Jews have shown themselves to be more sophisticated than us on many levels, right? And that's the reason that they've had their success within our society. But history shows us, of course, being more sophisticated than other groups, and that this is a kind of requirement of our dominance over those other groups, is that we're more sophisticated than them, right? So the sophisticated rule, essentially. And so I think that is also kind of one of the goals of Apolloism, is to create a more sophisticated school of thought where we're thinking along more sophisticated lines. We're thinking about how to develop, culture, art, religion, and so forth in a symbolically coherent manner, so that we're not dominated by these things by competitors. So in other words, that the story of Jupiter outwitting or overthrowing Saturn is apropos. It's something that is both kind of instructive and I think moralizing to us on some level, even though it may have these kind of unpleasant elements to the story, as it were. But I think that that's correct. We have to, the goal ultimately is we do want to live in a civilization, and we want to be civilized people. We're not, collapsitarians, but we don't want to be second-class citizens in our own civilizations or our own societies. We want to, we are actually blamed for ruling this civilization. Like, whites are seen as the group that rules Western civilization. So if we're going to be blamed for it, we should actually be the ones ruling it, or be the ones running it, and move it in good and positive directions, as opposed to the directions that it's headed now. But this is a matter of the most intelligent and sophisticated people becoming involved in civilizational projects like this, as opposed to people who think these problems can be solved through more barbaric means. I mean, it's just to the extent those things occur, they're unfortunate, but the ultimately we need a civilization. We need something that's sustainable. So even if this civilization suffers traumas in the future, it has to later stabilize and develop a civilization and culture that is truly ours. I mean, that's truly protective and ameliorating of our group. That's definitely something that has to occur. And in the Greco-Roman religion, the sort of sophistication of the religion and the culture starts to give us a model, or starts to give us ideas of how to kind of accomplish this. Yeah, I'm a little bit off on a tangent here. Let's return to the myth. So Saturn, Jupiter liberates his brothers and sisters, who end up being, I think the lion's share of the 12 Olympians, right? So he liberates Neptune, he liberates Pluto or Hades, and he liberates his sisters as well, including Juno, right? Mm-hmm. And he will marry Juno, which is his sister. We're talking about gods here, so there's more of there's no incest reference going on here. It's more, Juno represents a kind of racial sister, as it were.
Yeah, I think whenever there's a reference to brothers and sisters, essentially it means they're of the same blood.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. And I think that is a kind of interesting reoccurring motif in myth. And for example, Apollo and Diana are of the same blood, the Delians. And there are myths where Apollo is basically protecting his sister from what appear to be these sort of Semitic competitors. One is this Titan Orion, right, who's the hunter Orion, who becomes this constellation in the stars. But the myths there indicate basically a kind of ethnic sexual competition that's occurring there, right? And Apollo is basically defending women of his race, as it were. And the god, much like Apollo, represents so much like Judah in the Hebrew Bible represents both a tribe and a individual in myth. He's both a tribe and an individual in myth. Apollo has the same significance, and you can apply that significance to all the, at least all the main sort of chieftain gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon.
Would you say also, in a sense, that Jupiter has to actualize or precede Apollo, like sort of clear the deck for Apollo to be fully idealized?
Yeah, well, I think that Apollo is always a kind of aspiration and ideal. So it's almost like, I mean, we can call ourselves Apollonians, but it might actually be preferable if we always consider ourselves proto-Apollonian on some level, in the sense that, it, Apollo becomes ultimately a kind of eugenic project, where we're ameliorating or trying to perfect the Aryan type, essentially, to speak frankly. And so, obviously, we're not in the position to do that now because we're in what we would call a kind of dark age, would be one way of expressing it. And Jupiter, so we do require Jupiters, and Jupiters effectively represent proto-Apollonians, right? So we do require Jupiters, and part of Jupiter is this sort of clever aspect where, when he's overpowered, he knows he's overpowered, he can resort to a kind of cleverness, as it were. I mean, Jupiter, in our mind, we think of Jupiter as this warrior casting lightning bolts and this sort of thing, and as a dominant deity. But there was a period when Jupiter was weak, and it's represented in these stories. And the way that he, the way that he outwits Saturn is also kind of highly symbolic. Now, I don't know that I've kind of discovered the sort of the final meaning of what's going on there, though I have some theories. He takes a stone, or rather, and it might even be Rhea actually that is the active one here, or she's part of this kind of conspiracy, much as Gaia or Terra is part of this conspiracy to overthrow Uranus or Caelus, and assist Saturn to that end. But Rhea, so basically, but the plot essentially is that there are different variations of the story, and I'm not going to I'm not going to remember this perfectly, so consider this a kind of paraphrasing of the myth. A stone is wrapped in this sort of baby swaddling, and is thought to be a baby, right? So, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, and this makes sense, it's thought to be the baby Jupiter, right?
Yeah.
So Saturn takes the baby Jupiter and swallows it. The chronology of this myth doesn't entirely make sense, as should be clear. But he swallows this stone, which, at least in some versions of the myth, represents a kind of faux baby Jupiter, who he thinks to be Jupiter. He swallows the stone, and the stone causes him to regurgitate the other gods, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think that there might be variations on the myth where Jupiter's the is the cupbearer, so he gives him basically a kind of what's the term? He gives him a term. He gives him some kind of drink that allows him that causes him to throw up. That might be a variation on the myth. But the stone causes regurgitation, at least in one form of the myth. And so, what does that signify? I mean, we can speculate. The stone itself has a strong Semitic association, I would say. The stone, Yahweh is the stone. Yahweh represents the stone. So it's one of the symbols of Yahweh. It's a kind of earthly or chthonic symbol that has a strong connection to Jews and the Semitic world in general. So the phenomena of stone worship is a kind of Semitic phenomenon. So whether it was Jews or other Semitic tribes, there was this tradition of worshiping stones. The Sabaeans, for example, worshipped Saturn in the form of a stone. They worshipped Saturn in the form of a black stone in the kingdom of Sheba, as it would be called in the Hebrew Bible. Anyways, you were about to speak.
I was only going to say that it also indicates that we need to be comfortable with some deception, because it's going to be deception is going to be necessary.
Yeah, and we could also say too that in age of Apollo is a kind of more honest age, right? In many ways, and that's an age that follows Jupiterian age, or an age where Saturn is overthrown. So to your point, if we just look at the genealogy of the gods, we see that Apollo descends from Zeus or Jupiter, so he necessarily follows right? So if we're treating these deities as also ages or representing ages, that would make sense. So an Apollonian age follows a Jupiterian age, and that age is one where we can be more honest, right? Because when you're in power, you can be more honest.
Yeah.
That's something that we can even see today, right? We can. I mean, there are ways in which our society is honest that we would prefer it not be honest, in the sense that, like, and I don't even know that you can necessarily describe these as forms of honesty per se, but we think of like the proliferation of pornography, or of, just where people are free to speak very vulgar things. Ostensibly they're being honest, but is that a kind of healthy or useful form of honesty? I think you understand my point, right? But it's
No,
kind
I
of,
do.
yeah. So it's sort of the honesty of Saturn versus the honesty of Apollo, right? So the honesty of Apollo would relate to civilizational order, right? He's a god of order,
Yeah.
and would have a kind of positive or salubrious effect.
I know it's an imperfect example. Whenever I think of the relationship of Jupiter and Apollo, I think of Philip of Macedon and Alexander. Philip, you have a much more practical sort of basic guy, and he sort of clears the deck, and then Alexander comes along and is fully actualized, right? Again, not a perfect example, I know, but
Yeah, no, I think that there's comparisons that can be made there, certainly. Yeah, I mean, and I think you're probably aware of the reasons that it's not a perfect example. That film that Oliver Stone made, I think it's called Alexander. It's not a good film, but it's there. It does have some interesting things that people, listening to this uh, video will find interesting. I mean, I think because I think that there is. I think he does basically demonstrate a kind of understanding of the figure of Alexander, where it's just revealing to the figure of Alexander. I think it's more or less true to the figure of Alexander. People complain about him having a homosexual lover in that film, but putting that aside, and I don't, that's a kind of area of his life that I haven't looked into too closely for reasons that you can imagine. But it but he does ultimately represent a kind of bacchanal force on some level, and the film demonstrates that. In fact, his soldiers in the film are called Apollonians, interestingly enough. And his soldiers are Apollonians, and they are the ones who are opposed to basically assimilating or integrating with the East and taking Eastern brides and taking essentially non-white brides, which is kind of depicted in a very explicit way in the film. He takes a non-white bride, and this is part of his policy to unite the world, unite the civilized world, is basically to start marrying into these Eastern families and this sort of thing.
Yeah, that was
the Apollonians are like, no, we don't want to do that. This is, what I mean? So that's also a kind of hint or clue to the character of Apollo, right? Yeah. Because to do that is literally to seek to make the god himself extinct, because he represents the Aryan blonde northern invader. So naturally, something like that would be anti-Apollonian, just by definition.
Yeah.
Anyways, you were about to say.
Well, I was just going to ask you, what do you consider some Jupiterian characteristics? Like if we were
okay, yeah, I mean, we did a really cool, like, this is, you got to forgive me. I'm kind of a nerd with this shit, so I'm like really interested in like the myth and symbol. But when it comes to like the Roman values, and we had this conversation about the Roman values. I mean, on some level, they're so like obvious, like, and you agree with me on this point that it's like, but they're not obvious in the sense that we don't, people don't practice Roman virtues in today, right? There's a lot of kind of ignoble behavior and character, in the world, which is very evident. So these things do actually need to be said, I suppose. But yeah, Jupiter in his kind of most positive manifestation, which is the way that we would seek to represent him and honor him, really. And that's part of it too. It's not just that we're representing the god in a way that we find to be salubrious in terms of his influence on people. That's part of it, but it's also we're honoring the god, right? So if we depict Jupiter being noble, we're honoring him. We're saying you are noble. You know what I'm saying? And so that's one reason why artists should be inclined to, have these sort of positive depictions of the gods. But yeah, so Jupiter, his character, I would say, is the following: he's masculine, so virtus, right?
Right.
He has virtue, Roman virtue, which is distinct from Christian virtue. He's masculine, brave, intelligent, right? He's evidently able to so he picks his battles, which we see in this scenario where he overthrows Saturn. He picks his battles, so he's intelligent, and he's not a wimp. He's a badass, and he's also ambitious. He's strong in every sense of the word, right? So he's mentally strong. He's physically strong. He's he protects his gens, his family, his familia, his race, all those things. I mean, I guess it's how would you describe him? I'm interested to hear your take.
Well, one thing I think is really important for all of us is to understand how to be leaders, to understand how to lead effectively. And quite often it's not what people think. People think it's about delegating, but it's much more nuanced than that. And I think these characteristics, they're represented in some people that are in positions of authority and leadership positions, but fewer and fewer for sure. I mean, these sorts of characteristics, some of them, of course, are obvious. You want to be intelligent. You want to possess good judgment, and judgment usually comes from experience. But I think things have to be done on a generational timeline, right? Like decisions have to be every decision that you make in a leadership position, for example, has to be made with an eye to becoming, stronger 6 months from now, a year from now, 25 years from now. And, that's the thing that I think a lot of people just don't understand. We want to breed. Well, maybe breed is, a bit more callous of a word, but we want to cultivate leaders, and we want to cultivate a new elite. And a big part of that is understanding how to be a leader, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think virtus, the masculine aspect of it, is important as well.
I would say honesty without naivety is important. Judgment, of course. Delegation, when you understand, you can only delegate things when you really understand them, right?
Yeah.
Like, are there who would you pick as, if you were to look at, people in recent history? I mean, it'd be pretty hard to find them now, but any figures that you would say really embody Jupitarian characteristics?
Oh, geez. Well, I mean, yeah,
George Washington would probably be one, no?
Sure. Yeah. And there are others, of course. There are others in German history, for example. In not just the kind of obvious one that people are thinking of that's politically incorrect.
Well, Bismarck. Yeah, I think Bismarck is a great example, actually.
Sure. And of course, there's examples in English history too, among the monarchs, for example, in England, right, which is a kind of democratic phase of English history.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and honestly, I mean, even guys like, I mean, Churchill, for example, was a very flawed character, and he's criticized, I think, rightly, as being essentially a kind of warmonger, and ultimately his effect seems to have been very negative. But looking at him, you know, as a kind of nationalist leader, and I'm not a petty nationalist. He did have some virtues, of course, relative to contemporary leaders, right? And one among his virtues was intelligence, and and
Yeah,
a kind of,
he had
and
personal
feel,
bravery too, which I
yeah,
mean,
and
I'm
sure, and
definitely not a
fealty to
fan.
his people.
Sorry.
What? Oh, fealty to his people. Now, I think his people were too narrowly defined, but anyways, continue what you were saying.
Yeah, I was just gonna say. I mean, I'm not a fan of Churchill. I mean, I was early on until I had a little more exposure to him. But I mean, there's certain characteristics you do have to admire. He was personally, he was very brave. I mean, he had proven that. He was a very good speaker. He understood. What's important also is he understood the levers.
Napoleon, of course, would be another one too. I mean, Napoleon,
Probably the
again,
best.
yeah, again, a flawed figure, but he really, his flaws had less to do with him, I would say, and more with kind of what he deemed essentially necessary means to power, which was a kind of anti-ancient regime, sort of policy that he effectively, like he's essentially was responsible for, exporting the revolution, the French Revolution,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of things that we can say that are negative about the French Revolution, though you can even kind of say some positive things about it, because the ancient regime was not all it was cracked up to be, and eventually I think it had to die. It also obviously had some very good things, being a nobility and an aristocracy, which there's a kind of inherent value to that. But it was ultimately Christian, which was one of his flaws ultimately. And so ultimately we come down on the side of, not on the side of the revolution, but the revolution becomes kind of a means or will to power for Napoleon. And Napoleon, though, is not, he's the kind of the opposite of a kind of egalitarian figure. He is an emperor in the real kind of true sense of the word or term. And ultimately he was a pan-Europeanist, and he was interested in bringing Europe together, So I think that he would, especially though his ambition is Jupiterian, his success is Jupiterian, his ability to actualize, I don't know if that's the correct word, it seems like kind of a modern formation, but to his will to power, his ability to become powerful, to empower himself, is Jupiterian. Anyways, so Napoleon, I think, would be first among such examples.
Well, yeah, and his ability to marshal the will of the nation. I mean, that's something that's probably the ultimate. I would say that's the ultimate characteristic of a Jupiterian figure, is to be able to unite is kind of a sort of a broad overused term, but I would say marshal the zeitgeist of their people. That's probably the biggest characteristic, I would say. And one thing I think is very it's an important thing to keep in mind. I think the Aryan style of leadership has to be the Aryan style of leadership. Like, I think there's a certain set of characteristics that are really us, actualized and in their ideal form. In the same way that you wouldn't tell, a Mike Tyson to say, "Hey, look how successful this guy is jabbing and dancing. Look how successful Muhammad Ali is just jabbing and dancing," and then expecting him to replicate that style. I think certain people have their ideal styles of leadership as a people, if you know what I mean.
Sure. No, I understand what you're saying. Yeah. Well, So we're reaching the end of an hour. I think we've had a good discussion. I don't know if there's more like kind of myth related things we should go into in the next like 5 or 10 minutes, but it's up to you. Or if you had any questions.
Sure, let's bang out some questions if you want.
Oh yeah. Let's just look at the questions in the comments and see if there's any. Was polygamy eugenic for the Roman elite? And would you say it has a large effect or barely attributable to the success of the societies? Well, I don't think it was really, to the extent that it was a feature of the Roman elite. It was more of a kind of de facto feature in the way that it's a kind of feature of the elite today, I would say, in some ways. I mean, there wasn't a policy of polygamy. And again, I think that these are ultimately monogamous societies. But there is that question, and Rick, you and I have had this discussion as well, is that, well, what if, like, would an ideal society feature a polygamy among the best people, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that it's an interesting question that I'm definitely worth entertaining and thinking about. And you could even say, like, maybe there would be like a, much with like Mormonism, there could be like a sort of polygamous offshoot of Apolloism or something like that, right? Which, and maybe that's a kind of evolutionary experiment that would be useful or something. I tend to think that the downsides, though, of polygamy are as follows. One is that it's unattractive to women generally. Some women, I think, would be fine with it, but not necessarily the highest quality women. The other feature of it, I think, that is difficult is just the raising of children. I think it would create too much chaos with the raising of children. But so I think that generally it's not for Europeans. But again, I'm not a kind of closed-minded person in the sense that, like, I can understand the arguments for it from a eugenic perspective. And some of those arguments are kind of like, basically Plato advances something like this. Now, Plato, I think that there's a huge element of subversiveness to Plato's work. And though I'm not necessarily citing this as one example of that, but he kind of does basically advocate for a kind of polygamy in the Republic when he's describing an ideal society. Now, with him, there becomes this. I think that there's a kind of loose use of the word aristocracy, or the Greek equivalent of that word. From the best, essentially from the best. So the best will be breeding and that sort of thing. Now, I personally don't think it necessarily has a kind of racial significance in the context of Plato, but I think it would have a racial significance, ideally, in terms of a eugenic consideration. Obviously, among Aryans or the white race, it would have a racial meaning or significance. Or that would be an element of it, of course, because we'd also be interested in intelligence, beauty, and it's not just that people are white or whatever. You want the best representation of that group. That would be eugenic. But I think that Plato has subversive aspects, but he does sort of champion a form of polygamy ultimately, or in eugenics, where he's again, how he's defining the best becomes the question with Plato.
Yeah, you know what? I think that is part of the issue. I think you'd have to separate eugenics and polygamy. I mean, polygamy doesn't seem to be doing much in the Arab world, although it is increasing their numbers. Is it increasing their quality? So polygamy and eugenics don't necessarily coincide. And part of the problem also with polygamy is, I mean, personally, I wouldn't be opposed to it, but if
that's the real dilemma, right? Right.
Well, I guess it depends. I mean, there's pros and cons, right? But I think in the current environment, I mean, so it would probably come down to finance mostly, and who's got the money right now, right? So I mean, if we were looking at a situation where we had overall control, I think eugenics, I think a soft eugenics would be the ideal form in terms of incentives. Like, if people were, let's say, let's say you had people that were educated and gainfully employed, they could have incentives for having 3, 4, 5 children, incentives like early retirement or mortgage payments. And I think if you had people that were, on the idiocracy end of the spectrum, you would want to make it very difficult or just unattractive to have children at all or have one. But I think you want to have a soft policy to, essentially have people buy into it. I mean, polygamy, one thing polygamy does seem to work for, it does work for increasing numbers fairly quickly, right? The challenge, of course, is that you end up with a lot of excess males, and excess males can be destabilizing in a society. So you have to kind of send them out. So if you want to send them out to sort of move into other areas and establish themselves there, that works. But yeah, I guess I guess I would be more pro eugenics than polygamy. I kind of separate the two. If we look at the most eugenic period of probably the last 2,000 years, I would say it would have been just prior to the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you look at the quality of people that were born in a more advanced but agrarian society, you had your Benjamin Franklins, your Thomas Jeffersons. You had a very high quality of people being born, and they were being born to families that were more elite, right? They were the landowners. They had the means to provide proper care, and the infant mortality rate was way lower or way higher, sorry, for poorer people. So you did essentially have a very eugenic period then, and we saw the results of it, right? But yeah, that's my thought on that one.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, so I'm not for polygamy, but as I've said, I don't like. Would it be the worst thing in the world if someone experimented with something like that? I don't think so. I just don't think that the experiment would go well, is my guess. But I'm not, I don't possess all the wisdom in the world, and maybe it's something that needs to occur. But officially, I'm against polygamy. I don't think. I think it's mostly because of the children. Think of the children is, I guess, is what I would say. But what else was I gonna? Yeah, I don't know. Any other? I mean, I guess we get a little off the topic of Jupiter. What can I finally say about Jupiter? Yeah, he's the king of gods, um, and one of the reasons we think Apolloism, or we use the term Apolloism, is because Apollo represents the future. He represents a goal, and maybe a goal that's like the rainbow. We never quite get there, but it becomes, a standard which to strive, or toward which to strive. And so that's why we've taken the name Apollonians. But Jupiter is that's not to demote Jupiter in importance. I would say I don't think that we still acknowledge Jupiter as the king of gods, right?
Yeah, and Jupiter is much more in the here and now. The state,
Yeah.
the collective authority, the overarching culture, right?
Yeah, and he may always be, in the sense that he might be the god of the present, right? Whereas Apollo is the god of the future, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah,
And Saturn is the god of the past, right?
and those are very complementary too, right? I mean, when you have something that's essentially moralizing in the present, and you have something that you're working towards, then that's the perfect combination.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting. I mean, I think that part of it. This is a revival religion, and ultimately, it's inspired by the cult of Apollo and the other sort of celestial cults in the ancient world. But it's not. It's not a cargo cult. We're not just trying to sort of mindlessly imitate those cults. We're taking what we perceive to be their best elements, using our strongest common sense to make that determination. But I think that the kind of wonderful and cool aspect about it is that it does allow for innovation on our part. So even that formulation that I just developed, I don't know that the ancients came up with that exact formulation, or if they did, it's been lost, right? But this idea that Apollo represents the future, Jupiter represents the present, and Saturn represents the past, I think is a kind of useful intellectual or psychological schema or term or way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
And oh, please.
No, I was just going to say, you know, because of this, because there's a core understanding behind Apolloism, which is essentially eternal for us, but it's also dynamic in the sense of the application and some of the understanding, then that makes it just as relevant now as it would have been 2,000, 3,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. But yeah, let me see if there's any other questions in here.
Are there any big misconceptions about Jupiter?
Louis the Sun King, someone is recommending. I would agree with that. Yeah. His reign marked the height of aristocratic cultural development in France. It's true. And there's a reference to Apollo there, definitely. Napoleon as well, though, was very conscious of the Greco-Roman heritage of Europeans. If you look at the, I think it was in the MFA in Boston, they had a traveling exhibit with Napoleon's furniture, and it all has these kind of Greco-Roman references or features in it. And I think, and actually, which I think is really cool, is that he was especially attracted to Mars and to Venus, right? So,
well, yeah, you know, I think it would be fantastic actually for us to have a discussion at some point just on all the resurfacing of Apollonian tendencies or Apolloism, or however you'd like to phrase it, that have occurred over the last 2,000 years, because you really do see it come up. You see it come up aesthetically, intellectually, in a lot of different ways. And it just shows you that Aryans as a people have been wearing an ill-fitting uniform for a long time, right? And it chafes, and every now and then, you know, you do see these kind of things.
Yeah, the Renaissance was, you know, an example of that. Nietzsche described the Renaissance as he had some great description of what it represented, and I think it was he said it was like a kind of buried giant that was like, you know, moving out of the ground, but like, you know, it was like stirring basically under the ground essentially.
Yeah.
But would not fully emerge. I think that's a kind of fantastic description, and it's also a very kind of I don't know, it's a moralizing and optimistic one ultimately, because the giant can fully emerge in the future, right?
Yeah, it shows us that it's almost impossible to eradicate, you know, all the propaganda and, you know, everything that's followed, and it's still there, right? It's still in us. We still want to embrace Apollonian tendencies like beauty and the will to victory, and, you know, all of these things, right? They're still in us as a people more than anyone else, and, you know, it's just impossible to eradicate, right?
It's true. I mean, the gods have essentially proved immortal. So they are immortal. So they've shown that they are immortal. Now, it's funny because there is this. I was reviewing one of these films, looking at the gem and a Wonder Woman film, right? And there, Wonder Woman's. I think it might have been the first Wonder Woman film, the most recent of you know, cycle of Wonder Woman films that has the that Israeli actress Gadot, I think is her name, or Gadot or something. But she's Wonder Woman in the film, and her antagonist is Mars or Ares, right? Really? And he's like the evil guy, yeah. But it also the character of Wonder Woman is actually in the original mythos of that comic book. She is like understood as descended from I think she's, I don't know, I don't remember who her parent, but no, I think she's supposed to represent Diana, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, her name is Diana.
Yeah, but they may give her a different genealogy.
Isis, I think it was.
they give her a different genealogy. I don't remember it, but they associate her also with the tribe of Amazons, right? So with the Amazon women, and the Amazons are actually also Aryan figures, as it turns out. And I think there's a kind of misreading that goes on in National Socialist interpretation of Greco-Roman, or in one of the errors they make is this understanding of the Amazons. But the Amazons are descended of Ares or Mars, and but they're these kind of proto-feminist characters, right? So they're not ideal in some ways, but so she's of that group, and she might have a genealogy though I think they indicate her descendant of Zeus or Jupiter, at least in the film they did, and they show that they actually show Jupiter die in that film. First, like he dies, and he gives his legacy over to this kind of proto-feminist character of Diana, as Diana appears in the comic books through Wonder Woman. There's a Jewish screenwriter on the film, but if you did something like that in Rome, you made like a work of art showing Jupiter dying, that would be high sacrilege, right? Because Jupiter is immortal. He doesn't die. That's the whole thing about Jupiter. He's a kind of permanent. He represents permanence. He represents the overcoming of time. And that's the other thing I should point out. So Cronus, there's a metaphor going on with Cronus and Saturn. Saturn, Kronos, Koronos are all represent time as well. So when Jupiter overthrows Saturn, he's overthrown time, and he's becoming an immortal god. And he himself, again, he represents a tribe, much like Judah represents a tribe. So that tribe of Jupiter and that tribe of Apollo represent permanent immortal tribes, right? So there's something very moralizing about that symbolism, where you understand that the tribe itself, the race, the family, the gens, is immortal, abides. And they accomplish this by overthrowing time, which again is given the Semitic character.
Wow, I've not thought of that before.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Well, in fact, and there are other things too that are very interesting too. So that figure of the Grim Reaper that appears in the Middle Ages, that's also Saturn. So Saturn comes to represent death. And when we look at this symbolism in a close way, it's ultimately represents a kind of racial death in opposition to Jupiter and all that he represents, right? So it's pretty heavy stuff, but this is why though that we have to kind of keep an open and analytical mind when it comes to symbolism and myth, so that we can understand it, right? Because the goal here is that we have a religion, we have a culture that is our instrument that serves us. And for it to serve us, we have to understand it, right? It's sort of like, you're behind the controls of a spaceship. You need to be able to operate the controls. You need to understand the controls or how it works effectively, rather than being the subject of a religion, which occurs in Christianity, a mystery religion. We don't understand it. It's of foreign origin. Its symbols are deliberately mysterious, that are made opaque, so that we don't understand it. It's a mystery religion. So that's the distinction. And so we have to, I think that it's my philosophy that it has to be open and a non-mystery religion where symbols and their meaning are discussed openly. And, in that way, when an artist makes a work of art, we can evaluate it through our lens and say, okay, that's a good work of art. We approve of that. Or that's a subversive or bad work of art. We disapprove of that. You know what I mean? For example.
Yeah.
Anyways.
There's another question. Are there any big misconceptions about Jupiter? I mean, I would say kind of an obvious one is he's often, both Jupiter or Zeus, is often sort of portrayed as sometimes petty and sometimes a philanderer and, those sorts of things, vindictive.
Yeah. But again, there are myths that show him in a bad or poor light. So that comes down to mythos versus archetype, mythos versus symbol, right? But yeah, I don't know, misconceptions. I just briefly, and then I think we should close the call because just so you can get back to your life, and I can as well. But I think that there is there is an early origin to and this is something that we kind of didn't really get to discuss. Actually, we planned on discussing them before the call, but evidently Jupiter is an Aryan god. He's a sky god. He's a celestial god, and the etymology points to this, right? Deos is a kind of common root to is thought to be a common root to many of these sort of celestial gods in the Indo-European pantheons. And Jupiter is no exception to that. So the word Zeus is related to Deos, which is this kind of common root. But it's also related to words meaning day, bright sky, that are these sort of ancient Indo-European roots. So it's related to that, and he's explicitly, of course, a sky god in the Greco-Roman pantheon. And Jupiter has the same etymological origin, it's thought. Jovis as well, right? Jovis is a Latin. It's an alternate form of Jupiter, and it's we're familiar with the word Jove, right? So in Diana has a similar. So in Diana only becomes associated with the moon late, right? She's originally Diana is thought to be a kind of diurnal god or solar god, celestial god akin to Apollo. And all those are kind of Aryan symbols: the day, the diurnal, the light, the sun, the sky, the day sky in particular. So Jupiter is certainly that. There is a kind of interesting origin to Jupiter that is probably pre-Hellenic. So I think that there is pre-Hellenic influence in the development of the god Jupiter in the pre-Hellenics. Among them in a kind of leadership, you could say, or essentially what I describe as proto-Jews.
Right.
Pelasgian. I mispronounce this word, or I don't. There's different pronunciations for the word, so I guess I can be forgiven. Pelasgian, I think is the best pronunciation. So the Pelasgians are a pre-Hellenic group, and they're the ones who build the first oracle in Greece at Dodona. Dodona, I think is the pronunciation. Dodona is the first oracle in Greece. And the narrative, which is a correct narrative, is that so we have these celestial gods. What's described is that before these celestial gods arrive, and we understand these as sort of northern invaders, the Hellenes, the Hellenic racial type, which is kind of Nordic, it's comprised of various tribes, including the Dorians, who will become the Spartans, for example. But they're an fair Aryan group, in contrast to this earlier pre-Hellenic group. It's a kind of swarthier group, frankly, or whatever. But this group is very influential in the development of myth. And it possesses its own intelligence and creativity, very similar to the intelligence and creativity possessed by Jews today. So a kind of formidable group, I would argue. And they established the first oracle, and chief among their gods is Vulcan or Hephaestus, this fire god, who's a proto-Jewish or proto-Yahweh even. Right? Yahweh is also the consuming fire. That's one of their chief gods. But they also worship Jupiter, and they worship him at this oracle, Dodona. And at Dodona, Dodona is understood as first being occupied by a female earth goddess, very similar to Delphi. So the same thing is going on at Delphi. There's an earth goddess, and this earth goddess in the mythology of Delphi is represented by Python. And Python means, the name meaning of Python means rot. So Apollo destroying Python, it's like the Aryan defeating Decadence. It's a really kind of cool and vivid metaphor, right?
Yeah.
And but the similar thing happens at this other oracle, or there's a similar mythic history there where Jupiter overthrows an earlier phonic female goddess, Gaia or Terra, or one idea related to these sort of the Idean cult that's at Crete and also in Asia Minor, Phrygia. So Earth goddess cult that's overthrown, but it may also have these kind of male elements represented by Saturn, for example, because we understand Saturn as an ally of Gaia or Terra in her overthrow of the sky god. So it's Saturnian, but also Earth Mother cults that are overthrown, and Jupiter represents the sky, the Aryan element overthrowing. It does seem, though, possible that this proto-Jewish group, and I think they should be given credit for this, is influential in the development of some of these myths. And one possibility is that Jupiter, at least at that oracle, I mean, of course, he is an earlier, an ancient derivation from Aryan gods, and represents a kind of fixed Aryan type that's very ancient, a sky god, worshipped by our ancestors. He represents that, but he may achieve a kind of cultivation at Dodona, where he might even be understood as a kind of way of basically replacing the cult, because the way that we can understand the cult being overthrown is basically Hellenes or Aryans getting pissed off, right? I think that this is the history that it describes. So you have a cult that is a kind of phonic, exploitative cult that has orgies and this sort of thing, and all of these things are associated with these cults. And it's overthrown by this Aryan group that becomes irritated and just basically overthrows it. Like, I don't know what the modern day comparison could be, but let's imagine someone goes into Hollywood and just cleans it up in a kind of, I don't know, fascistic way, you might say.
Yeah.
That happens at this oracle, and then Jupiter is erected at that oracle, and this could be the first appearance of Jupiter in the Greco-Roman world. Now, we can say, in a kind of easy conclusion, is to say, okay, well, the Aryans developed that god and put him there. Another possibility is that this sort of proto-Hellenic group was basically said, okay, well, we need a different religion to appease these Aryans because they've gotten fucking pissed, and we need a god that represents their god, their chieftain. So we have to set up a cult that represents their chieftain, and that's another possibility.
Yeah, there could have been a mashup of sorts. And you actually bring up a really good point, and I'll say this kind of as the last thing on my part, and that's the occasionally, I wouldn't say often, but occasionally I'll hear people say, this is a Greek religion, or this is an Italian religion, it's not applicable to me. And that's a really incorrect understanding of it. This is an Aryan religion, right? So anybody who's, an Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Slavic, even, you have Indo-European Aryan roots, and these gods, in a cruder form, much less developed form, obviously were there, right from the start of the Aryan expansion. And the Greco-Roman or the Greek pantheon is, that's a one particular sort of treatment, if you will, of these gods, and the Roman one is, probably a more advanced and better one. But I mean, it's not particular to one, one nationalism, right?
No, that's 100% true, and that's especially true with the figure of Apollo, I would say. Apollo was associated with the Gauls. He was associated with basically every Western European group you can think of, and also there's a Slavic association there as well, because where Hyperborea is located is unclear, but it's given many different locations. And Hyperborea is, where Apollo is from. He's the Hyperborean. He's the blonde god. He has an epithet calling him the blonde god. And so I think that of all the gods in all the European pantheons, he's the one that's most clearly our guy, right?
Organic,
yeah. But he's obviously our guy. Whereas with some of the other gods, it's less clear because, again, what's often being described in these myths is the interaction, the collision, the warring, the vying, the exploitation of different gods that are interacting. And these gods represent ethnic groups. Like each god represents a kind of ethnic group. So in many cases, right, especially among the sort of primary chieftain gods. And so Apollo in that cosmology, or when we combine all the cosmologies, Apollo stands out as kind of the most Aryan god, dare I say, right? I mean, it's just,
there's no way to confuse him as coming from Africa or, some place like that, right?
Yeah. And we discussed this before the call. Even Jupiter can take on a kind of, whereas Jupiter at his root is an Aryan god, he can take on a kind of, in the ancient world, he can be given epithets and he can be identified with foreign gods in a way that Apollo can't really be, right?
Right.
So in other words, he could be, in other words, Jupiter has an Aryan significance, and he represents an Aryan ancestor, but he also has his significance as basically representing a chieftain or king, and especially sort of the primary head king or chieftain of the pantheon. And that significance in the ancient world was also applied to other ethnic groups, essentially. And a good example would be the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians have an Aryan history, but at some point they would decline and take on a different sort of racial character. And one of their gods there, who's clearly not an Aryan god, is this god Amon. But he, at some point, he will take on the appellation Zeus Amon, or Amon Zeus, I think it is. Zeus Amon, I think is it. But that just signifies him as the chieftain of a pantheon, or a chieftain god, or a king of gods, or something like this. It doesn't signify him as Aryan. So I think that there is both the kind of Aryan aspect and a kind of generic aspect, you could say, to Jupiter, which you don't find with Apollo. Apollo is very ethnic specific.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. Should we draw a line under it there?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. All right. Well, it's great chatting again, Mark. And be sure and let us know what you guys would like to hear us discuss on the next podcast.
Please do. Yeah, write in the comments what you want us to discuss on the next podcast. All right, I'll take us out with a song.
Nice.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words have forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late, they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes